What is up, hockey fans? Welcome to the Wraparound, brought to you by Sticks.com. I am your host, Emma Lingan. I am joined, of course, on this Monday by my wonderful co-host, Mike Augello. We are here to bring you all of the bite-sized storylines from around the NHL, playoff-related and otherwise. And we are going to get into all of that in just a second because the Leafs have leafed and they lost game 7, and Mike has a lot of thoughts. So we're going to get to that in just a second. But first, do want to remind you all that we are brought to you by Sticks.com. Why break the bank on sticks when you can get pro level composite sticks without the pro price tag at Sticks.com? That's STIX.com. Head over and gear up. Okay, Mike, I do want to remind you, this is a 30-minute show, so we don't have all the time in the world. If it's possible for you to give me your thoughts, again, for anyone who may not be aware, the Florida Panthers have advanced to the Eastern Conference Final for the third straight season. They destroyed the Maple Leafs 6-1 in Game 7 in Toronto. The Leafs were outscored 12-2 in their final 2 home games of the playoffs. And we know that the Leafs do not have the best record in winner-take-all games. They're 0-7. They've had 9 goals, 28 goals against, 1 for 11 on the power play. That's all since 2018. So not a huge sample size here, but still pretty significant. Looking at particularly, of course, the big hot topic, Austin Matthews, Mitch Marner. They've had 5 points combined in those winner-take-all games since 2018. Obviously not great. Do you think this is the end of the core 4 era in Toronto with Marner, Matthews, Tavares, and Nylander?
Yes, it is. And I don't think there's much doubt. When one of your best players, your leading point getter in the regular season, is the sort of focal point for the ire of the fan base, to the point that they're booing him every time he touches the puck in the final 10 minutes of the third period of a travesty of a Game 7, then I think the writing is on the wall. Darren Drager reported this morning that the Leafs during the season offered him a $13.5 million 8-year deal. And his feeling is that probably right now the Leafs wouldn't offer that deal because Darren Ferris, Marner's agent, rejected talking about the contract during the season. I mean, this is, as you said, this is the most Leafy thing that they could do. I said to other hockey writers, I said what the Leafs will do will be the thing of the most excruciating fashion would be to win Game 6, bring it back to Game 7, and then stick the dagger in the back of their fans. And that's exactly what they did. The first 10 minutes of that game was ridiculous. 21 shot attempts for the Panthers, none for the Leafs. Joseph Woll stood on his head, kept it 0-0. And then once Seth Jones scored that goal, they just decompensated and melted. And you could see, Berube lost his composure on the bench, started yelling at the players. Marner started yelling at the bench. They knew it was over with. And I think that, to go back to your question, is this the end of the core 4? I don't think the Leafs want Marner back. I don't think they're going to offer him what he's going to be looking for in free agency. I think he's going to have to go someplace else to get that money. Maybe they do a sign and trade and get draft picks and trade him someplace where he gets the 8th year of the deal. But I don't think he will be back. And I think it's basically 50-50 if Tavares will be back. But I think eventually, they'll come to that conclusion and bring him back. But Marner is gone.
All right. Well, we could, of course, spend an entire week's worth of shows talking about the Leafs and where they went wrong, where they go from here. But alas, their season is over. And so we are going to move on to teams who are still competing for a Stanley Cup. So that leaves us with the Florida Panthers heading to the Eastern Conference Final to face off against the Carolina Hurricanes. So this is obviously the second time in the last 3 seasons that these two teams are meeting in the conference final. Panthers got the best of Carolina last time. Mike, are there any signs, anything that sticks out to you that may be an indicator that this is the year that the Hurricanes get over the hump, or do you think it's they still don't have a chance against Florida?
I think Florida will be favored. I think Carolina, they play a very similar game to Florida. I mean, this is going to be like watching paint dry. They're really going to bang on each other. They're going to play in their defensive structure. It may come down to power plays. No, I think Carolina's got a little bit of an advantage since they got almost a week's worth of rest, and Florida's coming right off Game 7, going right into the series on Tuesday, I believe. So, they may have an advantage early on in the series, but sometimes a team that is coming off a long series, their blood is flowing, and the other team that has sat around for a while, it's a challenge for them. So I'm not sure how this will start, but Bobrovsky in the second half of the Toronto series was Bobrovsky, turned it on. He got a shutout. The Leafs only scored 4 goals in 4 games against Bobrovsky. So I think he's on. I think their defensive structure is working fine. And Carolina is going to have a tough time generating offense against them. If I were picking the series, I would pick the Panthers probably in 6 games. But, I mean, Carolina, if they stick to their structure, they can bore the Panthers to death and win a game.
Well, obviously, the way that the Carolina Hurricanes got here to the conference final is by eliminating the Washington Capitals. So with that, of course, comes the end of Alex Ovechkin's record-breaking season. He confirmed that he will be back for his 21st season with the Capitals next year, but says that he doesn't know what his future holds beyond that. So do you think that Ovechkin will continue playing once his contract expires? I mean, obviously he'll be in his 40s at that point. Do you think he'll go back to the KHL? He did say a few years back that he wants to finish his career with Dynamo Moscow, who he started his career with. So do you still see that as a viable option for him?
Yeah, I think he's going to finish out his contract. He's got one more year at $9.5 million with the Capitals. I think at that point he follows the sort of the Pavel Datsyuk model and goes to the KHL and finishes off his career there 2 or 3 years over there, and probably makes more money than what he's getting paid in the NHL because he's Alex Ovechkin and he's the king. He's the king of goal scoring. I think the Capitals are well aware of that plan. And, they'll have an advantage that they can scour the free agent market in the summer of 2026 and pick somebody, tough shoes to fill, but pick somebody who can step in for the grade 8. I mean, they have a good young team. They have some pieces there, and it's not all centered around him. So I think, I think they'll have a little bit of an advantage there that they've sort of broadened themselves, and it's not all about Alex Ovechkin.
For sure. All right. Well, let's head over to the West in the playoffs. The Dallas Stars take down the Winnipeg Jets in 6 games to advance to the Western Conference Final. They will face off against the Edmonton Oilers there. But do want to talk about that game 6 between Dallas and Winnipeg. Of course, Mark Scheifele had to play that game for Winnipeg under just heartbreaking circumstances. He lost his father, Brad, suddenly Friday evening, the night before the game. It was unclear that morning whether Scheifele was even going to play for Winnipeg. Of course, he ends up playing, and he scores the opening goal of the game, which, of course, was a very special moment for him, for the Jets. Of course, Winnipeg ultimately loses 2-1 in overtime, courtesy of Thomas Harley with the OT winner for Dallas. So first, I want to ask you, Mike, what does it say about Mark Scheifele's character and his leadership and just his courage to choose to play in a game 6 after such a tragic personal loss? And then just beyond that, kind of, it's tough to shift focus, but trying to shift focus to the on-ice performance for the Jets. Do you think that they especially given those circumstances, played well enough to deserve a better result in that game, or do you think it was pretty fair?
Well, first on Scheifele, I mean, I have the ultimate respect for him. Obviously, a tragic situation with his father, and he still decided to play. And I'm sure he was distracted, and I'm sure he was emotional. And scoring the goal was, I'm sure, probably in his head, he was saying that one's for you, Dad. I think the ultimate show of respect was in Handshake Alley after the game, where Jamie Benn, the guy who punched him in the face and tried to concuss him in Game 5, talked to him for about a minute, and you can just imagine what he was saying to him. It wasn't just him. It was the entire Dallas Stars team that recognized the character of this player. And, you know, we talked about a team earlier that doesn't have enough character. If they had a player like Scheifele, maybe they would have advanced in the playoffs instead of some of the players that they did have. So, yeah, I mean, it was a big thing for the Jets to have Scheifele and Hellebuck re-sign there, because those two players are the cornerstone of the future of the Jets. Now, in terms of the way that they played, I mean, remember, this team was supposed to lose. They were a 1.4 seconds away from being eliminated by St. Louis. So everything after that was gravy. And, you know, you had key players. Hellebuck, for some reason, just couldn't play well on the road. Morrissey came into the series hurt and left Game 6 with a knee injury, and I don't think they really recovered from that. Scheifele was concussed. You know, they were playing through a lot of stuff. So for them to get through to 6 games and push the Stars, so I think we're a much deeper and more talented team, to a 6th game was a credit to the Jets.
Well, and of course, the Jets had such a historically good regular season. You know, of course, they win the President's Trophy. They made some decent additions at the deadline, maybe nothing super flashy, but they made some decent depth additions. Looking back at this season and the moves they did make, do you think that this core is strong enough, the core of this team is strong enough to dominate in the playoffs over the other teams in the West, obviously this year aside, but looking ahead for this team, I mean, how do the Jets assess the season that was, and then looking forward, you know, what sort of needs or anything you think they need to address?
Well, I don't think the core was strong enough. Even, I mean, obviously, like I just said, they had injuries, so that was a factor in them falling short. But you know, you're facing the situation now where Nikolai Ehlers is an unrestricted free agent, and he's one of their better forwards. Now they've extended Iafallo, and they've extended a few other players, but Pionk being one of them. But if they don't replace Ehlers, it's going to be tough because it's Winnipeg. And I'm not throwing shade against Winnipeg, but it's tough to get players to sign there. So, I mean, that's going to be a challenge for Kevin Cheveldayoff. You know, they have not only Ehlers, but Mason Appleton and Brandon Tanev, who they acquired from Seattle at the deadline. They're both unrestricted free agents. I've heard Appleton could get $4.5 to $5 million in free agency. That might be a little rich. I know that there's a lot of talk about Brandon Tanev going to Toronto to play with his brother Chris. So, you know, Cheveldayoff will be challenged to find players to fill those spots. You know, they've got some prospects that will come up through the chain, but for them to maintain the level that they played at this year is going to be difficult, and especially in that division where you have, you know, Dallas and Colorado and Minnesota. There are a lot of good teams in that division.
Well, you know, I think one of the interesting things about the playoffs, but specifically this series between Winnipeg and Dallas, has, of course, been the goaltending matchup between Jake Oettinger, Connor Hellebuck. Looking at this series in particular, of course, these two goalies, two of the best, if not the two best, American-born goalies in the NHL right now. Do you think that this playoff series, this matchup between the two of these guys has influenced at all the decision for who should be the starter for Team USA at the Olympics next year? Because I think, coming into this, everyone would have said, well, of course it's Hellebuck. He's more tenured. He's a veteran. He's going to win the Vezina this year, all of that. But now, not only in the playoffs have we seen him struggle on the road, we saw him kind of struggle in the Four Nations face-off as well, not to maybe the same degree that he did during the first round of the playoffs, but still he looked like a mere mortal and not the superhuman goaltender that we're used to seeing. So I think, at least for me, it's raised some questions, and I don't think this takes away or, undoes any of the success that he's had in the regular season, but it does kind of raise some questions about Hellebuck's ability to win in these high pressure situations. So what do you think? Do you think that there is going to be maybe a little bit more of a debate as far as who the number one goalie should be for Team USA next year?
I mean, they also have the third goalie options that, if somebody has a hot year like a Gibson or a Swayman, if he bounces back in Boston, that they could be part of the mix. But it's probably going to come down to Oettinger and Hellebuck. And I think the way Team USA is going to approach it is the way Team Canada approached it in like 2002 or 2010, where they started with Curtis Joseph in 2002. He had a bad game. Then they went to Marty Brodeur. Marty Brodeur had a bad game in 2010. They switched to Roberto Luongo. I think that the round robin part of the tournament in Milano Cortina is going to be sort of a feeling out process between Oettinger and Hellebuck, and then they'll decide who the goalie is that goes through the medal round. If Oettinger wins a Stanley Cup, and that's very possible with Dallas, then I think he has a leg up. But I think that they will play both goalies and then determine who's going to be the one to play when the games really count.
Yeah, definitely an interesting wrinkle, I think, in this entire situation that we've seen from the Four Nations face-off through the playoffs into next year. Of course, Dallas takes down Winnipeg in that series. Then the Stars will now face the Oilers in the Western Conference Final for the second straight season. Of course, Edmonton won in 6 games last year to head to the Stanley Cup Final, where they would eventually lose to the Florida Panthers. But, we always, when we talk about Edmonton, it's always McDavid and Draisaitl and everyone else. But considering how important the supporting cast has been for the Oilers in these playoffs in particular, do you think that they have the depth to match what the Stars have this season? Because I feel like both teams these are two different teams than what they saw in each other last year in the Western Conference Final. The Stars have Mikko Rantanen now. They have guys like Mikael Granlund who have, stepped up in more of those depth roles. Oilers, forward-wise, don't look super different, but they are getting more contributions from other places throughout the lineup. Guys like Evander Kane and Corey Perry. And then you have, on defense, obviously still a struggle. Their goaltending situation is still a bit of a question mark. So what do you think? Does Edmonton have the depth to match up against this Stars team? And what is this matchup going to look like compared to last year's?
They don't have the depth, but McDavid and Draisaitl are the great equalizer. I mean, one of the reasons why I thought Vegas was going to defeat Edmonton was because Vegas played them 2 years ago, and what they did was they beat on McDavid and Draisaitl. They checked them to death, and by game 3 or 4 of that series, they were exhausted. They couldn't catch up, or they couldn't do that to Draisaitl and McDavid. And as you said, guys like Evander Kane, who will, I think, single-handedly make the NHL address the LTIR situation, because he sits out the entire regular season and then comes out in the playoffs like he shot out of a cannon. Him and Connor Brown and Adam Henrique, who had a couple goals in a key game against Vegas. They're getting secondary contributions, but their depth is nowhere close to Dallas. I mean, Dallas, they get Heiskanen back, they get Robertson back, they've got Sagan and Ben and Duchesne and Rantanen and Hins. I mean, their depth is remarkable, and Oettinger has been up to the task. Now, last year, I think they were spent by the time they got to Edmonton. They played Vegas in the first round. They played Colorado in the second round. And by the time they got to Edmonton, Edmonton had their usual cakewalk against the Kings. And I can't even remember who they played in the second round. But, once they got there, they were rested enough and they took advantage of the Stars, who I think were spent. This year, I think even though the Stars have played later than the Oilers, I don't think they're beaten to the ground like they were last year. That will be an advantage, and they're going to have to do what Vegas didn't do. They're going to have to check and weigh on McDavid and Draisaitl, and if they do that, I think it was Vancouver. Thank you. If they do that. And it was a shorthanded Vancouver with Artur Silovs in goal. So it's like it wasn't exactly like they were playing Thatcher Demko. But if Dallas can corral and abuse McDavid and Draisaitl a little bit, then I think that they can beat them. And I'm picking Dallas in that series.
All right. Well, it should be an interesting one. I definitely think this series will have a different look to it than last year's did. Regardless of the outcome. Moving on to some non-playoff related stories. Last week, Ken Holland named GM of the LA Kings. He made it clear that Jim Hiller will return to the Kings as their head coach next season. What do you think about this? I mean, we've talked about this on the show before, Mike, that the Kings needed a new GM. They needed to move on from Rob Blake. They've now done that. But now that they've done that, do you think that the Kings can win with Hiller as their coach, or should they have started looking in a different direction?
It depends on what the GM does and recognizes what the problems are with the Kings. Darcy Kemper was a nice Band-Aid in the goaltending situation. They got rid of Dubois, who was a albatross of a contract with them, and he's played well in Washington. But Kemper's not a long-term solution, and I still think, even though he had a fantastic year and is a Vezina finalist, I think they still need long-term help in goal. But their problem is they did not score enough. They had Edmonton down 2-0. They had him down in game 3, and then Hiller's decision to review that Evander Kane goal, I think, was the turning point in the series. So I scratched my head a little bit when Holland decided to opt for continuity and keep Hiller. Maybe he didn't think there was anybody out there in the coaching ranks that was out there that would be an improvement. But I wouldn't be surprised if a year down the line, if they don't do something positive, that Hiller is the fall guy. So I'm a little surprised, but I think in the end, it's going to depend on what Ken Holland does to augment that team and make them better so they can maybe finally beat Edmonton in the playoffs.
Yeah, interesting kind of landscape with all of the coaching vacancies in the NHL this offseason. I mean, some have, of course, been filled by now, but you had New York, you had Anaheim, Chicago, Vancouver, Philadelphia, like all of these, Boston, all of these openings that, I think have sort of, if there are teams like LA that you thought might kind of be on the edge, on the verge of maybe making a decision, maybe they take a look around the rest of the league and say, ooh, there's, like our head coaching vacancy might not be as appealing as a New York or a Boston or something like that. So it does kind of matter, I think, what is happening in the rest of the league. And I agree with you. Even if Hiller is coming back this year, I don't know how long of a leash she's going to have. So I think that it'll be interesting to keep an eye on LA and see what happens there. Last topic I want to talk about today, the Oilers, of course, we mentioned, headed to the Western Conference Final. To get there, they had to beat LA, as we mentioned, and the Vegas Golden Knights. So after Vegas was eliminated, Kelly McCrimmon talked this week about the interest that they had, of course, in extending Jack Eichel. Eichel's got one more year on his $80 million contract. He's eligible starting July 1st. He's eligible to sign an extension if he so chooses. So looking back at this season for Eichel, of course, career year for him. He put up a career high 94 points. He has 43 points in 40 playoff games for Vegas over the last 3 seasons. So it's very clear what his, impact has been on the ice for them. Looking ahead, assuming Vegas does want to get an extension done, we don't know whether it'll happen this off season or later, but what do you think with the cap going up and everything else kind of surrounding Eichel and his tenure with Vegas? What do you think his next contract with the Golden Knights would look like? And especially considering all of the other big contracts they already have.
Yeah, I mean, it's going to be an interesting negotiation. As you said, July 1st, he's eligible to sign an extension. But I know that from his time in Buffalo, the rumor that was always around was at the end of this deal, he's going to go home, and home is Boston, and Boston has a ton of cap space. The question is, will he hit the market in the summer of 2026? I know that Bill Foley and Kelly McCrimmon definitely want to get him signed. He's the same age as McDavid, so he's in his late 20s, and he's won a cup there. I mean, I think it's probably going to cost them, over $12 million a year. And as you said, they're tied up with a lot of cap room with, Pietrangelo and Theodore and Hurdle and Mark Stone, and maybe Mark Stone goes on LTIR again. So, I mean, and it's also a question of whether Eichel sees, if Vegas is a viable team going forward and a contender. I mean, they have a lot of age on that team. They've traded away a lot of their young players and draft picks. He might see an opportunity like Boston as a young team, turning it over and rebuilding as a challenge. So, I mean, if he doesn't sign by the beginning of training camp, then this is going to be a distraction like Mitch Marner was in Toronto, except you're not going to have the media asking the question every day or everybody pondering the future of Jack Eichel. It'll sneak under the radar a little bit, but if they don't get him signed by training camp, then I think that's a signal that he's probably going to go free agent.
Well, I mean, going off of that, do you think that you mentioned Boston being a team that has a ton of cap space, obviously has personal ties there for Eichel as well? Any other, kind of just off the top of your head, landing spots that you think would make sense and would be feasible for him if he doesn't re-sign in Vegas?
I mean, Philadelphia is so weak up the middle, and they're looking to turn things around. I mean, they've got a ton of cap space, and they have players like Konechny, but there's a big hole up the middle. So they would make sense. The Rangers would make sense. Anything on that Eastern quarter. I mean, hey, we just talked about Washington. It's like, you plug Jack Eichel in after Ovechkin, and what does that look like? I mean, I don't think teams like Dallas, Tampa Bay, Florida, Toronto are going to have the cap space to be able to pull that kind of move. But the teams that I mentioned, and maybe even Pittsburgh, because they're clearing a lot of their veterans out, they would all be looking for that linchpin number one center. And I'll add one more. How about Chicago?
Yep. I think just about every team is looking for that linchpin number one center. So it should, it could honestly be enough of an incentive right there for Eichel to go ahead and test free agency out, because he will certainly be a hot commodity, especially if he has another stellar year with the Golden Knights. So we'll have to see what happens there. That is going to do it, though, for today's episode of The Wraparound. Thank you again, of course, to Mike for joining me today. Thank you again as well to Stix.com for sponsoring us. We will be back with an all-new episode next Monday. For Mike Augello, I'm Emma Lingan. This is The Wraparound. Thanks for joining us, and we will see you next week.